COVID-19 has shaken all of us in one way or another, whether we have lost loved ones, suffered physically, socially, emotionally, mentally, economically. Truly devastating. One thing that I try to remind myself, despite any personal stress that I may be experiencing, is that I am truly grateful and fortunate. And the reminders that I often say to myself, and sometimes even out loud, are I currently have my health, the health of my family, food to eat, and a roof over my head. Not everyone can say that and could not say that even prior to the pandemic. Washington State had the third largest increase in homelessness behind California and Texas pre-pandemic, and I imagine that this has only continued to rise. Additionally, Washington State reported a 20% increase in family homelessness despite the eviction moratorium. This increase was one of the largest nationwide.
Welcome to Small and Gutsy, a podcast featuring interviews with nonprofit and social impact organizations under $10 million. My name is Laura Witkoff, and I'm excited and proud to be your host. My hope is that you love the stories as much as we do, and perhaps you will find needed services, a job, volunteer, invest in, or donate. Feel free to pass along any valuable information you hear today to others, and remember to send me the name of any organization you'd like featured at reachus@theintrinsicgroup.com.
Over 30 years ago, in 1989, a task force of local women in Whatcom County, Washington, saw a need for safe housing for women experiencing homelessness. The goal of this original program, Lydia Place, was to assist women in becoming self-sufficient while offering a safe haven for them and their families. Lydia Place's mission is to disrupt the cycle of homelessness and promote sustained independence for current and future generations. Since those early years, Lydia Place has expanded to include anyone experiencing homelessness, and they offer an array of programs to support the entire family. Their long-term vision is to have this generation be the last to experience homelessness, a truly beautiful and inspiring vision. In their own words, every family deserves a home. I am so very excited to introduce my guest today, Executive Director Emily O'Connor, who has been with Lydia Place for 9 years. Welcome, Emily. Share with me your passion about Lydia Place and how you became involved and engaged.
Well, thank you for that lovely and thorough introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today with you.
Thank you.
This was a little bit of a meandering journey for me, and I'll be honest, I didn't think I'd make it to 9 years. I'm sort of always surprised when I think about how fast the past nearly decade has gone by here at Lydia Place. It's work that just keeps feeding me as a human and leaving me more inspired, which enables me to keep showing up to do this work. There's also just a lot of work to be done. I have had the privilege, as you said, of being here 9 years, and it's been really an amazing journey of growth for the organization. Whatcom County here is kind of this interesting little experiment because we are small enough to be able to look at problems and think about how could we actually eliminate something like homelessness here in Whatcom County, contrasted to larger cities where, I think about LA and 60 or 70,000 people experiencing homelessness, and the problem seems so overwhelming that it almost feels like, how do you even start? But here in Whatcom County, we talk about that sometimes. You could experiment in a community of this size with some creative initiatives and see if you could really do the things that we try and do as nonprofits and fulfill those missions.
As you know, I live in LA, and the homelessness issue is just horrific. And yet I wonder if we can find models out there, even in small ways, to emulate. Would we not be better off to really consider those? And you're one of those models. What brought you into the space of homelessness? Was there something about homelessness or?
Yeah, I do think there's a lot to be learned from the smaller places where we're experimenting, right? And how do we scale that up to some of the larger things? Because the problems are the same. It's the size of the problem is different, but the problems themselves are the same. So if you can fix them on the little scale, then in theory, you should be able to scale that up. I've lived here in Whatcom County. I came here for college 20 years ago now and haven't managed to wiggle out of this lovely piece of planet Earth yet. I had cooked my way through high school and college and got degrees in sociology and political science. And as I was about to graduate college, I realized that a combination of sociology and political science with a bunch of kitchen experience amounted to exactly not a lot of career opportunities. And so I started volunteering with domestic violence and sexual assault services of Whatcom County, and really working one-on-one with survivors and doing system work and legal advocacy. And I loved that advocacy work. I loved being a part of the journey for individuals and families who are trying to create a different space for themselves and for their children. And what I really found was that although I loved working one-on-one with people, it was the larger system challenges that I kept being drawn to, and really thinking about how are the structures in our communities set up such that we keep seeing the prevalence of issues like domestic violence. What are the cultural implications? What's the responsibility for all of us in solving these issues, not just the person who's experiencing the violence, right? So really looking at criminal justice response and like all of these poverty, all of these things that that perpetuate these issues.
It's really your sociology background that kind of
that's right. Very useful, as it turns out, useful after all, as was the political science. I went and got my master's in social work at the University of Washington, and really just started to feel that shift toward system level advocacy and policy. Because it sort of felt like if we just keep looking at it on the micro level, like what's happening with the individual, we're always going to be behind, because these are such deeply ingrained structural issues that we're up against. And it's not well, that's not my problem, right? This is a problem for all of us. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes. And so I was in the violence against women field for those 10 years. And then I spent some time in the court system with the CASA program that trains advocates for kids who are in dependency cases and foster care and so on. Then I became a mom myself, and I was like, okay, the roads were leading towards prevention and children. And what I think I'm learning most from being in this role is that we have issues to work on as a nonprofit sector. And there's this opportunity, I think, to bridge the direct service. Like I loved doing that work with people, but also the policy and system change work. And we end up in silos oftentimes of, well, this organization does micro work, and this organization does macro or policy work, and this organization does the funding pieces, right? And then there's politics and all these other things. But what I have noticed is that if we can bridge the divide between those who are doing the direct work on the ground and those who are making the policy and funding decisions, if we can bring those two things together, then maybe we can make some real difference. Coming back around to the work of Lydia Place, we do housing, and we're focused on families with children. One of the things that we do in this community is we utilize motel stays as emergency shelter for families with kids, because we don't have one here. It works. It's functional from the perspective of it takes a family with kids from a car or a tent and puts them into a space that is a roof. But motels are really not a place. I'm a parent. I have 3 kids, and I don't want to spend any length of time in a motel room trying to, feed my kids 3 meals a day from a microwave with nothing but a little bathroom sink. There's no space. You can't get away from each other. It's not talking about resorts on the beach. We're talking about the cheapest motel room you can find. Sometimes the housing situation is so challenging here from an affordability and access perspective in Whatcom County. Families are staying up to 6 months in a motel room. They're not literally homeless right now, except that's the wrong place to start from, right? What's the best possible way for us as a community to respond to a family with children who are experiencing homelessness? Dream up the best possible thing, and then let's do that.
It's the difference between a Band-Aid and really being able to shift and change lives for these families moving forward, and then their ability to give back, which is what happens in that cycle, right? When someone really gets on their feet, then they're able to use that wisdom to help somebody else.
There's so many issues, and this past year of the pandemic has sort of illuminated to a new level many of the things that we really need to grapple with, especially as, dominant white majority communities. And we have to confront those. We have to step into that space, that really uncomfortable space, and own what that looks like before we can dream up what those solutions are. There seems to be this long ingrained status quo of focusing on the fire in front of you And then it's a distraction from the forward-thinking strategies and thoughtful planning that you just referenced. Here in Whatcom County, we had a rough season around homelessness here in Whatcom County. We had a major tent encampment protest here in Whatcom County called Camp 210. There's been a lot of upset citizens really thinking about the ways that we move or sweep camps. And we haven't come up with solutions to those, right? But it has also kept the focus of the conversation on the immediacy of unsheltered folks and not looking at why are there so many people in Whatcom County experiencing homelessness? And how did they get to the place that they're in? And what did we fail to do for them starting probably before they were born? And from Lydia Place's perspective, we're saying, hey, community, guess what? The kiddos who are the next generation of the Camp 210 residents, they're in our programs right now, or they're not in our programs yet because they're on the waiting list. And we can keep focusing on the fire and be guaranteed the next fire will continue to be lit, or we can figure out how to manage that and then turn our attention to prevention.
I agree with you. I think we're too busy putting out fires. We're so busy deciphering those things. We don't think of the collectivist responsibility that we have to our fellow citizen and how if we boost them, it actually boosts us as well. We have a healthier overall community, and that's what prevention's about.
I get it. It's a heavy world. For some of us, we have the privilege of not engaging with Facebook or social media and saying like, I need a mental health break from the heaviness of the world. But for many others in our community, they don't have that privilege. They don't get to turn off the trauma, the daily trauma in their lives. That impacts everybody. We see it in, the businesses that are unhappy or the folks who don't want to go downtown because they don't feel safe on the streets, the criminal justice costs, the healthcare costs. It's there. It's just that we don't seem to understand that it's connected to everything.
It's so true. And until we have a crisis like this where it furthers the divide because the folks who didn't have a choice in order to get a paycheck had to put themselves at risk early on. Right. And also those who were very well educated in the medical community put their lives on the line, too. Not that that isn't part of their job, but bagging groceries, one never thought that was going to be risky, and it became risky in some way. And again, we talk about silver linings a lot. If there's any silver lining to any of this, did it wake us up enough to recognize that this divide is unhealthy for us as a larger community, and we have to invest dollars and energy into not getting there in the first place? And so we have to help each other.
It's like things have to be bad enough that you're forced to engage, and then we don't want them to be that bad.
No, you're right.
And yet, as soon as we bounce back enough economically, vaccines, etc., then we might fail to take the opportunity to learn. And instead we're like, great, how do I get back to normal? I'm like, but normal wasn't working for a huge number of people in our communities. So let's not jump back to that normal. Let's move forward to a new normal, one where we don't leave our children of color behind and continue to segregate our communities and all of these other pieces around violence and criminal justice reform that we want to see, and just this trauma after trauma after trauma. But it's one big experiment, this humanity.
Let's jump to the programs at Lydia Place.
Okay.
And I think listeners would be so ready and interested in hearing how you've done it and how we continue to spread the word about you.
Well, thank you for asking. I tend to talk about why we do this work much more than I talk about what the work is that we do, because that's where my heart is. But we are addressing the issue of homelessness. And we're particularly focused on families with children because we know when we invest in the kids, we win for everybody. So we are responding to crisis at Lydia Place because the families that get referred to us are experiencing homelessness when they come to us. Like many communities around the country, we have what's called a coordinated entry system, which is supposed to help and does prioritize the most vulnerable households for services first, because of course there isn't enough for everyone. And so we've seen, for example, through the course of the pandemic, that the waiting list for families with children has more than doubled. And we're just getting to the point where the eviction moratorium questions are going to start to get answered, and the ripple effect of all of that behindness, that economic loss, which has been disproportionately shouldered by women and people of color, we're going to start to see the ripple effects of that. And already we've seen family homelessness has increased, as you mentioned in the beginning, significantly here in Washington state, and it's more than doubled here in Whatcom County. And so Lydia Place is entering families' lives from that place of they're experiencing homelessness. But what we found is that, as we were talking about before, sort of the framework is wrong if we're just saying, what's your housing status, right? So we could take a family with kids, they're experiencing homelessness, we could put them in a housing unit, even pay their rent for a period of time. And if we just say goodbye, that is likely not to be a good outcome. Housing status is not our success rate. We want thriving, healthy, happy humans. And so we have to look beyond, okay, are you housed now or not? And say, how do we support the family? How do we make sure that the children have access to resources in a way that their parents did not, such that they can be better off? One of the things that we did was we built in about 5 years ago a parenting program. So we have the housing and the sort of support around budgeting and getting connected with benefits and services and thinking about employment and education, all of those components. And then we have our parenting program, which works with families from, prenatal through kindergarten and beyond, and really looks at the parent-child bond and helps parents figure out, how to deal with some of the emotional or behavioral things that might come up, developmental information, have access to resources, collaborate with the school districts and childcare and all those other providers that might be needed. And then the third piece that was sort of kind of the remaining elephant in the room was mental health. It's like this stigmatized thing, mental health, but I sort of feel like this past year of the pandemic has broken that open a little bit to where everybody's realizing like, oh, I can experience trauma too. My anxiety can peak too. And that's not something that happens to other people. That's something that happens to everybody. That's a human condition. So we launched a mental health program to do that, to fill that gap, because our case managers, they're kind of acting as clinicians because that's desperately what is needed, but they're not equipped to do that. And our community health system is also ill-equipped to respond in the way that is needed for people experiencing trauma. And so we said, well, we're just going to dip our toes in the water. And we started with a little baby contract for therapy. And then we actually partnered with graduate programs. We said, well, let's see what we can do with some graduate interns under the supervision of a licensed clinician. It's such a natural recipe to have all of these components together, the housing, the parenting, the mental health, in a flexible model that can come to you whenever you need it. It's bridging the silos, right? Like, well, you do mental health and you do housing and you do parenting, but that actually doesn't work well for families. They're already trying to juggle so much stress in their lives. So pulling these services under one programmatic roof has made a big difference. I love the title of this podcast because that sort of is how we feel about ourselves at Lydia Place, is that we're small enough to be creative. Our funding is diverse enough. We're not locked into just government funding where it's like, well, these are the rules. You've got to just do. We're like, no, if this person and this family needs this thing, we're going to do that. And so that has meant that we have to be really collaborative in the community to have the partnerships and the funding. And this is an all hands on deck. So we welcome anybody in the community. We say, there is a place for you to help with this, whether it's your time or your talents or your services or your dollars or your advocacy or whatever position of power or privilege you might be able to open a gate for us in. All of these creative partnerships that come together to help fill those creative needs for our families. And that's the fun part.
Because it's a collaborative model, in some way you're role modeling for the families how to be collaborative within themselves as well, because there's so much stress inside, especially, but then you have this exterior stuff and then you have these kids and you're worried about how they're going to fare. And so you're managing all of that probably in a relatively small space or in temporary housing, as you pointed out. And so to have this collaborative model work with you is demonstrating to them how to interact and work with each other. And I love the idea of both meeting them where it's most convenient for the families. And also it sounds like you'll provide some groups. So it provides support among the families, because then they can really connect with other families who are maybe experiencing some of the same things.
Yeah, I think about that often, that's actually the remaining missing piece. We're service providers. And we want to be in their lives for as short a time as possible. Right? I rely on the humans in my life to help me when I'm overwhelmed and overloaded and I need extra help. And most of our families come with very little natural support systems. We need to fix the physical ways that we design our communities that allow for it. So for example, we know that children, the studies have shown that low-income children who grow up in mixed income neighborhoods will have higher upward economic mobility than low-income children who grow up in low-income neighborhoods. And so when we keep segregating, this is a low-income housing project, we continue to perpetuate those systems of inequality and poverty. We can't provide that service at Lydia Place. We can't give you family and friends. We can help make connections. But, to your point, Laura, like oftentimes who we can help make those connections with are other people who also are struggling. And really what we need is, as a community, we need to wrap our arms around these families in a way that we've never done before, that actually creates relationships with them, that helps be the mentors and the aunties and the uncles for their children who can, pitch in when somebody get a single mom with 3 kids who then gets sick and is out of work for a week, who helps with the kids. The nonprofit system can't solve that problem. This is a community problem to own.
How do we build real community? Because that's what you're talking about. How do we build real neighborhood in the best possible definition? I love the idea. What comes to mind is there are plenty of older people who don't have families and don't have those, particularly during COVID, don't have those social connections. And I wonder if there are communities that would come together and gladly participate in this as just a pilot where you might lead that. You can't provide all the services, but you can gather the folks around the table who might be willing to participate. It's a brilliant idea.
I wish I could pour myself into this as a pilot. It would have to be 2 pieces. One, it's policy. It's how our county and local cities, it's the zoning, right? And the development incentives and what projects they authorize so that we do not continue to segregate via income and therefore via race our communities. So that's step number 1. We could experiment here and think about how to bring those things together. The challenge oftentimes, Laura, is that we're so swamped as a nonprofit already. And the waiting list is so long. That comes back full circle to the crisis in front of you problem, right? The work that I actually want to do is that work, the long-term work, the community building work, because that's the actual solution. But how do you do that when there's a kid sleeping in a car today? As the general public, how do we ensure that our systems, like our local governments, for example, prioritize the things that are aligned with our values? And I think there's real misalignment currently in what the average good human would like to see their government help with and what government spends most of its resources on. But nonprofits are swamped. And so we can't take on the things that we should take on, which is just these systems were set up to maintain inequality. And you know what? They're doing a darn good job.
So now, of course, I'm thinking with my consulting hat on, because that's where I go, is wouldn't it be great, rather than the government at this point, because I agree with you, is to really look at creating a pilot with groups of private-public partnership, or get a foundation to say, we're going to pilot this and start small, building a network of volunteer services that folks can be volunteers or recipients, sort of the give and take of being in a community.
I can give you a for example, which is what sort of re-sparked this thing that I've wanted to work on for years. Early on in the pandemic, I took up running because I needed a therapeutic outlet. And one of the podcasts I ended up listening to was a sort of an explanation of a program in Canada where they have sponsor families, and you have to, in order to sponsor a refugee family, you have to find 5 households who commit as a pod to being the sponsor host, the landing pad, essentially a built-in natural support system. And you have to help them every step of the way. And there's enough, because there's 5 households, if one is like, oh, I have, somebody got sick or via surgery or lost a job or whatever, there's 4 others. Because it's also like, how do you make sure it's not an overcommitment? And I was like, wow, I love this concept. And how could we rally around vulnerable families in our community differently? Mm-hmm. That, and then shed some of the there's liability and risk and boundaries and all of these sort of typical white frameworks that we come with about risk analysis. And how could we just shed those somehow and play around a bit.
I love that idea. I think your run was well worth it, not just for your own stress,
Yeah.
but I think it's a really interesting, we have to start continuing to be innovative. We've seen the pandemic force many of us to be innovative, and I don't think we should stop because, as you said, these problems aren't going away. They're embedded historically for a whole bunch of reasons, and we have to start addressing it differently. There are other countries that do this far better than we do. They have intelligent folks emerging from their youth because they've equalized to a certain extent education, and we don't do that. We divide and conquer. We don't bring together. And yet we are a capitalist society who believes in competition. So why aren't we infusing the competition? Because we should all rise to what our full potential is given opportunities. I love that idea of creating pods or creating some kind of give and take. And we actually interviewed a for-profit who's just launching, and it's an interesting concept, not quite the same at all, but I wonder if there's something to build off of it, called Heart-Centered Strategies, and they're creating a app called I Shared, and they're all about reducing carbon footprint, but through giving and taking within your kind of local area. I sort of call it a big potluck that everybody brings to the table something they don't need anymore, and other people get to take it. And so a couple quick, silly, examples where, in a neighborhood, you don't need 20 lawnmowers.
Oh, interesting.
Or I don't need these pair of jeans that haven't fit me. So, of course, they could go to Goodwill, but wouldn't it be interesting to, have a connection with another person who actually could use them? And I've certainly seen this with my graduate students and even with my own kids, as they're embarking on their careers. A lot of people don't know how to network. So how can we expect a family that's isolated because of poverty or domestic violence or other kinds of emergency situations that can happen? Why are we not teaching the concept of being able to network and creating that opportunity through those who have and can give, even if it's of themselves or their friendship or whatever it is? And this I Shared app came out of this woman's, the founder, Dr. Julie Harrison, having had a fire and having moved to a new location and not knowing anyone. And she and her cat were literally homeless. But it was exactly what you're talking about. And so I love that idea, and I think you need to do it.
There's so much innovation that needs to happen. And the part that just gets me is that we're smart and we know what needs to be done. We know that every child should get food and shelter and love and enrichment and access to programming and good childcare. It's not rocket science. We actually don't need to analyze those problems any further. We just have to decide not to do these things anymore. There's so much wasted energy out there. And I think, your example about like the jeans and the lawnmowers is the perfect thing. This is another area that I could get lost on so many tangents, but that I think about with the nonprofit sector often is that people call us constantly with things they want to donate. I have a mini fridge or a piano or a computer or baby clothes or a bicycle. And we cannot warehouse them all and then match make them all. And like, there's got to be a tech solution here. Because we'll say like, sorry, we can't take your mini fridge today. And then 2 weeks later, it would have been really useful for something, right? Or I have a bed to donate or a crib, whatever it is. There's a person out there in the community who could really use that thing. How do we make those connections? Because we all feel crummy when we are getting rid of stuff we no longer need, knowing full well that somebody really needs it. We just have to be smarter and figure out how to adapt our systems to collect that energy as opposed to waste it. The systems were designed by human beings with a specific goal in mind, which, if we're being perfectly honest, was about accumulating wealth for some people at the expense of others. Explicitly accumulating wealth for white people at the expense of people of color. And if we can own that that was actually the design of the systems by humans, then we could take responsibility for redesigning them. We have to get past our fear about what that means.
Well, we have to really recognize that it's an investment in all of us. Segregating people out of a certain part of our society actually hurts the whole society. It doesn't benefit us. It might benefit you individually because you get more, but do you really need that more? And aren't you better off when you see innovation come out of this person who really got a fair chance, right? And then all of a sudden came up with something amazing because we allowed that potential to be grown. I mean, that's really when you create a society where people have opportunities, it's amazing what can happen.
And this collective human suffering it's a wound on all of us. And I think that we don't recognize that, but it takes deliberate action to remove compassion and empathy so that it doesn't hurt us, right? Like, I'm not going to pay attention to your suffering because it hurts me to think about it too much or makes me feel guilty. It wounds all of us when we turn our backs on each other, knowing that people are suffering. And if we just could feed that more with these relationships, with giving people opportunities to be helpful, to see the impact of a kind word or a smile, I think, as opposed to how do we just advance capitalism and make more money in the extremes,
Further isolate folks to handle things on their own when that's really an unfair expectation, because none of us have ever truly been on our own. We didn't come to these places by ourselves. And so therefore, why do we have that expectation that others should? And I think most people are willing to work hard and willing to put effort in. And I think it's a very small percentage of folks who may not want to do that. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us to have that belief system, because then we can be partners in everybody's raising up, right? That's what it should be.
We talk about this in the Whatcom County community a lot, that we have a leadership gap here. We have a visionary leadership gap. And I think we experienced that as a country. Leadership is important. Feeling inspired is important. Feeling like you know where we're going and why it's important to go together is important. And when we lose sight of that, we tend to retreat to our small little pods, right? Our small little circles, and do the othering things. But we need those leaders to stand up and say, this is what we're doing and why. We want to engage everybody in the conversations. We want to say, it actually matters if you show up and vote. It matters who you vote for. It matters who's at the table making the decisions about the millions and millions and millions of dollars that are coming here to Whatcom County. They're going to get spent, and the decisions are going to get made. And are they going to get made in a way that you feel proud of? Right? And how are we able to participate in those things? These systems are just so automatic at this point that it can be easy to disconnect. Nobody has ever said to me, I'm okay with children being harmed and abused and neglected and hungry. Nobody has ever said that. And so we have to find the unifiers that bring us together, and then we could do the things.
You talked a bit about the programs, and I know there is, at least from the fundraiser that I got to witness online, which was so remarkable, the art therapy program that you have, or that might have been just a point in time, but I would love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, we don't have an art therapist in our clinical program at the moment. The clinician that we referenced in the event that you got to see this past weekend, which featured a local artist who was a former client of Lydia Place. She had come to Lydia Place when she was fleeing domestic violence with her 4 young daughters, and ended up in our housing program, and was really trying to rebuild as domestic violence. It takes such a toll, not only physically and financially, but also emotionally, on self-concept and motivation. And she was really thinking about, how do I rebuild myself as a person? The art therapist that we had was one of our first graduate interns. And we thought, I don't know, can we take on an art therapist? Our licensed clinician isn't an art therapist. So how do we supervise that effectively? And, as sort of is typical for Lydia Place, we're like, well, let's see. Let's see if we can figure it out. Let's try it. This is a resource. Let's not let it go underutilized. And it ended up being such a beautiful thing. And here this was one example of this mother who finally, after sort of 8 months of working with her case manager, said, okay, I'll try an art session with the art therapist. And it reconnected her with this whole part of herself that was about creativity and expression and empowerment, and a different way to process the trauma she had experienced. And instantly she turned it into, I am going to be a champion for other women. I am going to take this renewed sense of self-confidence and rekindled identification of my own value as a person and what I can be for my children. And I'm going to share this out with the world because everybody should be able to feel this. And we see that all the time. You give people a little bit of love and validation and support, and they can blossom into the potential that they have to then spill those good things out into their community. And Emmy, who we're talking about here, is just such a beautiful example. And I think about her 4 daughters that she's raising and their mother who overcame significant hardship. And this is not a person of means. She is still a single mother of 4 with, working, selling her art and giving back and donating. And those are it's the ripple effects, right? Those are the ripple effects. We haven't had another art therapist since then to answer your question, but every time we have experiences like that, it reminds us to be as creative and diverse in the things that we can offer as possible.
I do have to ask you one question, which I'm sure you get asked. How did the name Lydia Place, where did that come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I respond to the name Lydia regularly because people think like, oh, Lydia, I mean, Emily. I'm like, it's okay. I answer to Lydia too. So Lydia Place, you mentioned in your opening, was started by a small group of local women, a group called Church Women United, which was a multi-faith group. Where I am is adjacent to the house that they originally bought to start a transitional housing program for women with children experiencing homelessness. They decided to go with the name Lydia Place. Lydia comes from the Bible. The organization has never had a religious affiliation, but its name comes from that origin with that multi-faith group of women. They landed on Lydia because, and this is not my area of expertise, but Lydia in the Bible was a merchant, and so she was engaging in sort of, making her own money and helping others, selling cloth. Purple cloth is my limited understanding, which I know I should be an expert on this origin story, but I'm not. And so Lydia Place, that's where the name comes from, but also the color. We've got purple everywhere. All of our buildings are purple, which is also the color for domestic violence awareness. A couple years after I started, one of the women who had been in our programs and exited called to share what a huge impact being in the program had had on her life. And she has this, lovely new husband, and they had just welcomed a baby girl who they named Lydia because of the impact. And I mean, what a lovely it was so sweet to hear. We love hearing from people like, I just graduated with my engineering degree and never could have done that without, a little bit of support, right?
So great. And you have over 30-year history, so you do get to see folks graduate and move on and really build their lives because you've provided that support. It's really beautiful and heartfelt, and your passion is coming through on this Zoom so clearly. And I see the macro piece of that. I really see that you are a driver and a leader. And so my hope for you and Lydia Place is that you get to reframe as the dollars come in to experimenting and innovating and seeing what works to actually try to rebuild versus continually put out fires.
Small and Gutsy is sponsored by the Intrinsic Group, my boutique management consulting firm specializing in guiding organizations to leverage talent, optimize processes, and to ensure the organization's narrative is aligned with their culture. We'd love to invite you to be a sponsor. So if you're interested in sponsoring Small and Gutsy to keep it going, please reach out to me at reachus@theintrinsicgroup.com.
As you know, in my podcast, we always end with a round of quick, gutsy questions. And so if you're ready, I'd love to start those. What is at the top of your wish list for Lydia Place? However, the answer can't be money or funding.
The top of my wish list for Lydia Place is a thoroughly engaged Whatcom County community. It really has nothing to do with this organization. It's about everybody in this community stepping up and saying, I'm going to pay attention and I'm going to participate. And I'm going to show up in the ways that make a difference, not just for me, but for the people I'll never see or may never, pass or live in the same neighborhood as.
If you were to think of a song that describes Lydia Place, what would it be?
Oh, this, you know what? We would have to be here for hours for me to.
That's okay. Are there any songs that anyone sort of within the Lydia Place community, you think that it would represent? And it could just be the name of a song too. And I'm not so well versed in the music world myself. That's why this question is always sort of fun.
I am now going to ask the staff for the answer I should have given, and I'm going to email you that.
Okay, I polled the staff about what song might be a good theme song for Lydia Place, and I have to say their suggestions were a bit sweet, a bit sentimental, and a little on the nose. So I asked my 3-year-old what her favorite song was, and she requested Turntables by Janelle Monáe. She just really likes the great beat and is particularly fond of, and I'll change the lyric here so that it is not a cuss word, but you messed up the kitchen, now you should do the dishes.
What makes Lydia Place gutsy? You've talked a little bit about it because you said you really love the name of the podcast because you fit that description. So what do you think makes it gutsy?
It's our commitment to doing what's right and not doing just what we're told and not doing just what we've always done. We don't want to be part of a system that is perpetuating poor outcomes. If we come across a problem or something that says, hey, the way you've been doing something is not working for me, then we want to fix that. And if that means we pay more money for something or change a staffing structure, or how do we retain flexible money that can actually go confront the problems and not just lock dollars into rigid rules and regulations. That's a culture here at Lydia Place. This is about creativity, it's about flexibility, it's about constant change and constantly making mistakes and learning from those mistakes and trying to be the best versions of ourselves on behalf of the community. And that's what we're committed to. We have values here at Lydia Place that we try and uphold really strongly: equity, upstream impact, community, and employee wellness. And those things are really the heart of what we're doing and what we want for the community.
What is something that outsiders or maybe even a few insiders don't know about Lydia Place?
I think that there's oftentimes a sort of an oversimplification of some of the challenges. And there's a lot of misconception around homelessness and how it is that people become homeless, why they become homeless, and what the solutions are. Sometimes the disconnection is partly between Lydia Place, I get to pay them to do these things that I then don't have to think about, or support them to do this work. But really what we believe in our value structure is that this is a responsibility of all of us. And that system change and equity work actually means we're going to come back to you to talk about how this is actually, it's not other people made bad choices or different choices. This is all of us together that has created systems of inequality. And so I think there's a careful way to engage people on a values conversation and from that values perspective that invites them to the table to say, we're actually more aligned than you might think if you just look at labels.
If you could get one celebrity or influencer to endorse or talk about Lydia Place, might it be? I know.
Not more pop culture.
What I would love is the ears of people in positions of power, policymakers, the Joe Bidens and the Kamala Harrises, and then all of their department heads. What I really want to do is I want to have them hear the stories of the clients that we serve so that they can integrate what the world actually looks like for people in marginalized communities and those who are displaced and disadvantaged.
What's the best way for folks to find out about you, connect with you, volunteer, learn about you?
So we try and maintain a really thorough and active presence online and in social media. And so we're way more techie than I am personally, but any platform, I don't know about any, but most of the platforms probably that folks are engaging with in social media, we have a presence on and would love to connect with folks there. And then of course our website has contact points for everyone. And we love hearing from our community and those outside of our community. One of the silver linings of having to pivot during COVID is that through engaging in virtual platforms has allowed us to communicate with and invite participation in like our events, for example, from all around the country and around the world oftentimes. And so, our last event, we did have a celebrity on. It was a local celebrity here. And so then he had his following from all over the place joining. And there's a beautiful thing in that, and people can give to, it doesn't actually matter where the child lives, right? It's a child is a child is a child. And I don't care where on the planet they are. I want them to be okay. We're accessible and reachable and love sharing ideas and resources and thoughts with folks from all over the place.
That's great. So what's your website so that folks, if they're...
LydiaPlace.org, LYDIA place.org.
So Emily/Lydia, now
Yeah.
Emily, I just really want to take a moment and thank you for spending so much time with me today. I learned so much about Lydia Place, and I think just as important about the community effort and the collaboration and your frame of how things really need to change in our collective culture so that we can address not just homelessness, but all the surrounding components so that truly the next generation will not have to deal with homelessness in the way this current generation does. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. What a privilege. This was a lot of fun.
It was great. It was just delightful. And my hope is that we all stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends, give us some stars and write a review on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts, or buy us a coffee. buymeacoffee.com/small and gutsy. I want to thank my partners in this endeavor, my co-producer, sound engineer, and composer, the amazing Pavel Franson, my exceptionally talented graphic designer, Nate Addy, my social work intern extraordinaire, Stephanie Tran. Please check out their bios on the Intrinsic website and all the folks, friends, and family who have guided and inspired me. Our blog of these small and gutsy nonprofits and social impact organizations can be found in the organizational stories section of the Intrinsic Group website so that we can continue to link clients, volunteers, future employees, investors, and donors to this small but mighty network. Of course, we can't take responsibility outside of our own vetting of the organizations we interview, so before you sign on to support or work for them, we encourage you to do your own due diligence and research them as well. We just want you to learn about the small and gutsy nonprofit and social impact organizational sector so they can spread their story and their impactful work. From small and gutsy to big with impact, I'm Laura Witkoff, and thanks for listening.